Welcome, everybody, to another episode of the Beyond Terrain podcast. I am your host, Leah Dalton. If you're new around here, consider following the show or subscribing. And if you enjoy the show, leaving a review or a comment helps immensely. Best way to support the show, obviously, is by sharing. Your voice matters and spreading these ideas. And right now, we're actually building something extremely special, very close to my heart, the Beyond Terrain community. A place free from censorship, full of real, deep discussions rooted in true health, personal sovereignty. I really wanted to make this community the last stop. I'm sick of all these trends, these gurus, supplements, detox protocols. No more blind faith in systems that just don't serve us, whether they be modern or false alternative ones. This is just going to be real autonomy, real deep understanding, and the tools to reclaim your health and your life and that of your family as well. Right now, the waitlist is open. You can sign up to be a part of the movement. It's a great way to support the show while getting some value in return as well. So, without further ado, let's dive into today's episode. As an introductory question, I ask all my guests uh, to define health. What is health? How does it manifest? What does it look like? Kind of leave it a little open-ended for you to take it in any direction that you'd like. So, a little definition for health.
I don't
Big
know.
question.
Yeah, I don't think that's the right question actually.
What
Uh,
would you ask?
what would I ask?
Yeah,
Uh, Depends what I want to know.
fair
Because
enough.
the problem with asking what health is that anybody's quote definition will be incorrect. And so then you start right away with an incorrect conclusion, assumption, hypothesis. And I think it was Aristotle or somebody said, give me an assumption and I can prove anything.
Sure.
So you start with nonsense and then it's going to deteriorate from there. And so there's no way I can tell you what health means, you know.
Sure.
So, I wouldn't bother doing that.
Fair enough. So, would you say, I guess, that in a way, it's a little bit subjective then. I guess what health would mean to someone. We've asked the question. It's funny because we've asked the question about 75 times now, and it has been a different definition every single time.
Right. That's like why there's 18 definitions of the cell membrane, but only one definition of a Schnauzer dog. Uh, it's because nobody has seen a cell membrane, so they're free to make up whatever nonsense they want. But not everybody has seen a Schnauzer dog, but you can go and look at it, and they always look the same, more or less. I know there's somebody out there who says their Schnauzer dog looks different than other Schnauzer dogs, but basically they look the same. So you're actually confined by reality.
Hmm.
Whereas if you're talking about viruses or cell membranes or genetics or evolution, you're not confined by reality. So you can make up whatever nonsense you want, and nobody is any wiser because they think it's somehow profound or real.
Like, this sounds like a fundamental problem in science, right? Because I was taught in school, obviously, a lot of nonsense as well, but, we were taught that communication is some of
That's
the
the
like,
point of
is the most
school.
important part of science, right? So, papers and the discussion section is there was a huge emphasis on that, right? So, is that kind of one of the things that's holding science and even empiricism back?
Well, science as we practice it today is a essentially a process of there's different words for it, but basically like post hoc explanations. And what I mean by that is they start with a claim and then the claim gets disproven. And then they have a fork in the road. So they can either say, well, that theory or that hypothesis has been disproven, or they can make up a new story to keep the old story going. So let me give you an example.
Please.
Around the late 1800s, they said there was these particles, things you couldn't see called viruses, And every time somebody was encountered a virus, they would get sick. In other words, there was a virus that caused chickenpox, right? Chickenpox is a distinct disease, and there's a specific virus that caused chickenpox. And everybody who gets around somebody with chickenpox will get the virus, and then they'll get sick, right? That was
Yep.
what they said. Now, they then went out into the world and realized that they said, well, this person has chickenpox, so they must have the virus. And this person was around them and they didn't get sick, right?
Hmm.
So that disproved that claim that everybody around this first person with the virus gets sick. So you could then say, yeah, that theory isn't any good. There may be not even a virus because we didn't see it and we didn't know. We didn't really have any reason for thinking that that's how it worked. But, or you could say, that's because the people who don't get sick have a good immune system and they know how to protect themselves against the virus, right?
Yeah.
And so that became the what I'm calling the post hoc explanation for a falsified claim. And
Hmm.
then they move on and say, well, what is this immune system based on? Antibodies, right? We all know that. So that's the
Yeah.
next claim. So, in other words, if you make antibodies, those are like proteins, those protect you against getting sick from the virus, right? So, you get measles, that's a virus, and then you make antibodies, and then you don't get sick from the virus ever again. You have
Hmm.
mumps, that's a virus, you don't get sick ever, you make antibodies, you don't get sick ever again. You get the flu, you make antibodies, you don't get sick ever again, except you get sick the next year and then every year after that. But that's because the virus knew how to escape from the antibodies. And
Yeah.
then you get antibodies to HIV, and that means you're going to die from the virus. And I remember hearing that as when I graduated from medical school. And I thought, what the fuck? Like I just spent 4 years learning that if I have antibodies, I'm protected. And this guy, Gallo, gets on the television and says, yeah, if you got antibodies, that means you're going to die. But everybody believed it, and they still believe it. And they still test people for antibodies, thinking that that means they're immune to the virus. And then you have somebody who tests for antibodies, like against measles, and they're positive, but they didn't never had the shot for measles. And you say, well, then they don't need the shot, right? Because they're immune to measles. No, we don't believe antibodies, so you still have to get the shot. this
Comedy.
is
Yeah.
make believe.
Yeah, it is. It's storytelling, right? It's storytelling, and you either have to ignore the contradiction or you have to spin a story about it to make it fit, right? It's
Yeah,
gotta
it's
fit
just
in some way.
it's nonsense. It's just making up stories rather than saying, you know what, this whole thing wasn't right from the get go. Anyways, how did you know it was true? And they never do that. So they just keep spinning the story. And they do that with economics and politics and you know the Russians are bad guys, no, the NATO's the bad guys, and then they spin the story and Zelensky's a clown and he plays the piano with his genitals. There's some YouTubes of that. And and you think, wait a minute.
Oh,
It's just theater.
yeah.
Physics
Yeah.
is it's just it's make believe. They tell you that things are in two places at the same time, right? That's quantum physics. You've heard that, right?
Yep.
So like it's very useful actually because I have a house that I like and I want a house on the beach. So I just bought some property by the beach and I'm going to have my house be in both places at the same time because that's how physics works. And that's saved me a lot of money.
Yeah. That would be nice. That would be really nice. Yeah,
But
yeah.
in physics, they say when something is moving, you can never tell thing A, thing B, which one is moving because movement is always relative to each other, right? So you can't say A is moving and B is still, or B is moving and A is still. You can only say they're moving relative to each other. Now,
Gotcha.
that may sound weird, but it's actually very useful because ever since I realized that, I don't go to the store to buy food anymore. I wait for the store to come to me. And I can tell you it's saved me a lot of money on food bills. And you lose a little weight and all because you don't eat as much because so far the store hasn't actually come yet. But I know it's a principle of quantum physics, so it must be true.
Yeah. The foundation is there
By
is
the
no
way, the
foundation.
interesting thing about this,
Please.
just to finish that, when I asked physicists, so why doesn't it work with my house or my dog? I don't have a dog, but I have a cat. Like my cat isn't in two places at the same time. He says it's too big. So I said, what about a turtle? That's smaller. No, it's too big. What about a bacteria? No, too big. It's only one place. What about like a little thing you can see under a microscope? No, too big. So it turns out the only things that are in two places are at the same time are things that are invisible.
Surprise, surprise.
And so I said, well, if
Wow.
they're invisible, how do you know they're not in 10 places at the
Oh, cut
same time?
out there. Yeah, so it's interesting, right? There's no foundation, and there's no logic to any of this. So over on the YouTube, we talk a lot about empiricism and rationalism, and we kind of say that is empiricism completely useless? Maybe not. You might be able to make a case for it, but we need to have, use strict empiricism. Absolutely. And there needs to be logic. If we're going to use words, we need to consider, semantics, logic, etymology of words, because we got to have good meanings. Or, in your mind, are we just fooling ourselves here with any story that we spin, or is there a more meaningful story than the other? Like, how would you even go about that discussion? Like, how do we implement logic into this to create, actual meaningful stories that we can tell ourselves? Or are we just kidding ourselves?
I tell you, anybody who wants to get anywhere in life, here's my suggestion. And,
Yeah.
and this actually, I didn't know this, but I've been doing this my whole life, and I didn't know anybody else like did it, or that it's actually like a spiritual path, which I didn't know that. But it's called neti neti in Hinduism, I think, which
Okay.
means you don't worry about what's true. You just find the claim and find out whether it is true. So they
Gotcha.
say the heart pumps the blood. Well, you can easily figure out that that's not possible. Now, that doesn't mean you know what moves the blood. And there's a very simple example, like, and you can see what you think of this. Guy's 18, he's Asian, his parents are Caucasian, looks in his parents' closet, finds adoption papers, right? Goes to his parents, say, "Yeah, you never told me I was adopted. Is it true?" Yeah, we didn't want to tell you because we didn't want to upset you, and that's why you never saw pictures of mom pregnant, and etc. And we got you from an orphanage in China, right? So
Yeah.
that's all very clear. You go to your best friend, you say, "Yeah, I'm a little shook up. I just found out I was adopted." And he says, "Who are your real parents?" I don't know. I was adopted in China. I don't know. I don't know. He says, "Until you tell me who your real parents, I don't believe you were adopted." Like, that's crazy.
That's not, it's crazy.
You know how many people I've said there's no evidence that measles is caused by a virus? And you know what they say? So what causes measles?
Exactly.
Like, who's your real parents? And
Yeah.
until you tell me who your real parents are, I'm believing that old story. Even though, if you say to 99% of doctors, how does a virologist show that measles is a specific disease and B caused by a virus? You know what their answer is?
What?
They have no friggin' idea at all. None.
True.
They say there's a test. You say, what's the test? Antibody test. What is it testing? They don't know.
No clue. Yeah.
No clue.
We're obsessed with knowing, obviously. We feel like we need to know things. I mean, that I feel like that's why we've tried to explain everything out since we've, been able to talk or recorded history or whatever, right? We're obsessed with knowing. Now, maybe cycling this into a discussion on child rearing. What message are we telling our kids, right? We read them storybooks. They go to school and they learn about science and how everything works and what they should think and all this stuff. Maybe we could cycle that into the conversation surrounding maybe even your new book. I'm sure it covers these topics.
Well, the first thing is I would question sending them to school,
Right.
because that's a huge mistake. If and you have to understand where the whole idea of school came from and what they're trying to do. But yes, I wrote a book called Common Sense Child Rearing, and the basis of it is you don't your job. We have this idea. There's two things that really get parents. Like,
Mhm,
the first is the idea, which is a story, that if you don't teach your children that they're going to end up as savages and homeless and cocaine addicts and in prison and raping young girls or some variation of that, that if you don't civilize them,
mhm,
that's what happens to people. There's no evidence that that's true. In fact, the evidence is that it's not. But that's what you think. The other thing is if your child misbehaves, especially in public, like does weird stuff, that's a reflection on you, and
mhm,
you're a bad parent. And everybody can see it because your child is like having a tantrum and throwing stuff all over the place. And that means you're an incompetent parent. And you can't have the world seeing that, even though you secretly believe it's true. Uh,
mhm.
so you try to do whatever you can to convince them to act more normal. Of course,
Yeah.
they see through that and make it worse because a child's job seems to be teaching you how to be a better person. And if you're too dumb or too clueless to get that, they have to go to extraordinary means to get that point across. Once you realize that, uh, the whole thing becomes a lot easier, and it becomes just sort of a fun exercise in how to live with another person.
Yeah.
But until you figure that out, and I got into that. I was a family doctor. I saw thousands of children, and school doctor for a while until I realized that wasn't any good. But um, I would see children, even like quote autistic children, and
Yeah.
I ended up thinking every symptom a human being has is their body's best attempt to communicate or heal.
Mhm.
In other words, you get a splinter in your finger, you make pus. The pus is not an infection, it's the way to get the splinter out. You
Yeah.
breathe debris in your lungs, you get a cough and mucus and feel bad. That's to get the debris out of your lungs. You poison somebody with all kinds of stuff, your body, like you, put it in a bag, and that's called a tumor, right? It's all just adapting to the situation in the best way you know how. So if and I can ask you this question, you're a 2-day old baby, you come into the world, and you're all excited and you're grateful your parents for giving you life. And the first thing they do is inject you with a bunch of poisons to keep you from getting a sexually transmitted disease, right? It's called a
Does
head.
give you a great message.
So what would you do? What would you tell your parents? Or what would you do?
As a baby, I mean, what can you do,
You
really?
can
You
scream.
internalize it. Yeah.
You can scream.
Sure.
Make their life miserable, right?
Sure.
And that might get them to say, you know what? Like, we just did this thing to our baby, and he or she made our life miserable. Maybe I won't do that again. But a lot of times, you stop screaming after a while, and then they'd stop doing it for a few months, and then cut 2 months rolls around, and what happens? they inject you 3 times for uh, for make believe viruses like polio and DPT and all this tetanus and all this, poison you again, and then they do it again at 4 months, and then they do it again at 6 months. So what would you do?
Keep screaming.
Keep screaming and act goofy and shit all over the place and make them clean it up, right? And just try to make their life miserable
Yeah.
because ultimately you understand that they're nuts and
Mhm.
they're probably doing this to themselves too, like flu
Yeah.
shots and taking drugs for whatever and working in stupid jobs and paying taxes and all kinds of stupid stuff, right? So you got to wake them up because you love them and because you're grateful for giving you life. Now, some parents eventually get it and some don't. And if they don't, you have to up the ante.
Mhm.
So you start banging your head against the wall. And then you go out in public and you do weird shit. And people say, "What's wrong with your child? He's got autism or something." You take him to the doctor and he thinks he has a disease. And and he's, by the way, he's also poisoned now. So, right, he's got problems. Uh,
Yeah.
but you're trying to wake your parents up and nothing is working because
Hmm.
they're like totally clueless.
Yeah.
And so you keep escalating it, and then sometimes it never ends. And the reason I think that's true is, again, I had patients like this, and they would come in and say, "Can you fix his autism?" and blah blah blah. And I'd explain what I just said. This is not the problem with them. The problem is with you. And
Gotcha.
immediately the child would act differently. It's like as soon as they heard that, and I would say it in their presence, they would say, "Finally, somebody is gonna like help me, like communicate." Because I'm just like too. I don't know how to communicate, properly. Like I can't write and speak properly yet.
Mhm.
So I need this guy, and I would actually tell the children, like, let me explain this to them. You don't have to act like this anymore. I will help you out, explain it to them. And interestingly, what I would start seeing is a child who wouldn't eat like a good diet before would start eating a good diet afterwards because now that it isn't their problem, then something seems to light up in them. I should listen to this guy because I do have a problem, right? They poisoned me and my gut is all messed up. And so, this was not a benign insult that I was given. So I do
Mhm.
need some, like physical help. And then they would eat it and take whatever I wanted to give them. And a lot of times they would be fine.
Yeah. Yeah. This kind of ties into this huge overarching idea of not taking responsibility. You want that thing to blame, right? Because if they have a disease and it's genetic and it's whatever, then the parent doesn't have to take the responsibility.
Right.
And that cycles into so many other avenues of child rearing and health and life in general.
Right. As my friend Kelly Brogan says, there's only one disease, and that's victim consciousness.
Absolutely.
So
Yeah.
and that's, if there's one thing I learned in medical school, the main thing they teach you is it's never something the patient does, except if they smoke and then they're a dumbass and they deserve what they get. Somehow
True.
that one has got their hackles up. But it doesn't matter anything else. It's either uh, genes, you got a genetic problem, you got an infection with a virus, you got stress or bad luck.
Yeah.
That's it. That's why
That's
you're
it.
sick. Even though, truth be told, there's the whole genetic theory is just one big nonsense after another. They say you get these genes and they code for proteins. One gene codes for one proteins. Then they do this human genome project, allegedly, find 200,000 proteins and 10,000 genes. Now, apparently, geneticists are not good at arithmetic because otherwise they would realize that there's 180, 90,000 proteins where there's no code.
Yeah.
So what happened there? Like, I mean, that's what I mean. They falsified that claim.
Hmm.
Now they can't even define what a gene is. They don't know what the hell's going on. And, the ribosomes where the genes are coded, the mRNA is made into proteins, turn out to be made up. So there is no ribosomes, easily proven. But they just make it up and they just keep making up more and more complex things. It's like one of my real heroes, a guy named Ivan Illich, when you talk about school,
Yeah.
said, school is the place where if you do well in school, you get the dubious privilege of being allowed to consume more school until you've consumed so much school that the only people left you can talk to are similar consumers of school. That's
Yeah.
that's it.
That's
So
it.
you got this specialized language nobody understands. It's like code. Like the economists, they have these code words, and virologists, they have these code special meaning words, and nobody knows what the hell they're talking about. And if you haven't figured this out, you think they must be smart.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, it's all like a cult, right? It's like a religion. It's, they're in their circles and no one else can understand what their
Yes,
Latin is, right? If you don't know Latin, you can't read it, you can't understand it. And, we know Latin, so we're better and smarter and, you need to listen to us, obviously.
yes,
Uh,
that's
You
how it
know,
works.
something that kind of popped into my mind was the book How to Become a Schizophrenic, and it kind of ties into this idea. Great book, but it
Yeah,
kind of ties into
I
this
like
idea
that.
that you were discussing about like the development of autism, even, right, or any of these illnesses. It's almost like a self-fulfilling prophecy, like in a way. I'm curious about your thoughts on that, how that ties into that, even tying in the idea of genetically testing, even when the baby's not born, right? Like having these preconceived ideas of, oh, well, there's potentially going to be this and potentially going to be that. We know that genetics is nonsense. We know that these tests are totally unfalsifiable or have been falsified over and over and over again because you get the genetic test that says you're positive for BRCA gene and then you never develop breast cancer. Right? We know that they're nonsense, but this whole idea kind of contributes to this self-fulfilling prophecy of these diseases, disorders, however you want to classify them. How does that tie into this idea of developing, any sort of illness, mental, physical, etc.?
Yeah, I mean that was a great book, How to Become a Schizophrenic. Joel Morrow, I think his name was, and he
Yeah.
was that, I don't know, 30-year-old guy who could remember what happened to him. And basically he was like 8 or so, and he realized that if he acted goofy, he wouldn't have to go to school or something. So he acted goofy. And
Yeah.
then his parents or friends, teachers, whatever said, "Oh, you're just like Uncle Fred." And Uncle Fred was schizophrenic.
Yes.
And he said, okay, well, I stopped acting goofy for a while. And and then he did it again because he didn't want to go to school or he didn't want to do this or it was fun and he get people. Children love to get their parents all riled up, get their goat. That's part of the fun of being a child, to see how hysterical you can get. Because what you're trying to do is teach your parents not to give you autonomy and not react. Like the best example, this also works with cats. I go out and I have this cat who lives outside and we worry about her. And it's really cold and I come and deliver her hot food. As soon as I really want Lucy to eat her food, she doesn't eat.
Sure.
And I say to myself, please, Lucy, you got to eat your food. You're going to get hungry and starving and cold, and you're going to be an icicle and freeze. She won't eat. because I'm infringing on her freedom and right to choose whether she wants to eat or not.
Yeah.
As soon as I give that up and I bring her the best food I can and say, "Here, Lucy, you can eat it or not," she just eats it.
Mhm.
Like, what's the deal? So, so that's part of the fun is to because it's her choice and her right to choose whether to eat or not. Same with your child. Now, if you infringe on that and try to make them learn stuff or behave in certain ways or act in certain ways, they will often respond by acting goofy to get your goat.
Mhm.
Now, then you take them to the doctor, and doctors don't know any of this stuff, so they think you have a disease like childhood schizophrenia, and so
Yeah.
they say, Freddie, if you act like that one more time, we're going to put you on drugs. Now,
Yeah.
at certain point, it becomes like a kind of default way of acting, and that he describes that he set out doing this consciously, like he would decide to act goofy, and at a certain point, it kind of took over, and he lost control of it. And then he would act goofy just because he always acted goofy in that setting, and he couldn't really help it, sort of. And now he ends up on drugs and in a mental hospital and all kinds of things, and he can't quite get himself out by not acting goofy, probably because the drugs, and he's scared, and that's what happened. You lose control of a situation.
Yeah.
But he could remember that whole thing, and that's what was so brilliant about that book. Most people can't remember it. He could,
Sure.
and he got himself out of it by saying, no, I got myself into this. And
Yeah.
I'd say it's similar to most any disease, so-called disease.
Oh, you know, one of the things that he really emphasized as well, and you brought it up, and I'm really happy that you did, was, the aunt or uncle or relative that had, some sort of psychosis or schizophrenia, whatever you want to call it. This obviously falls under this sort of genetic category of, well, it's in the family, so we got to be careful, right? And then they obviously start treating the kid different because they don't want them to end up
Right.
schizophrenic. So they start treating them like they could be a crazy person, which would, of course, make anybody crazy, obviously. But you know, this whole idea of familial or heritable behaviors, genes, we call it genetic due to DNA. Is there any validity in your mind that it's due to something that is within our biology, within our system, or do you believe that it's fully environmental? Like, is it how the child was raised, how they were even conceived? That maybe story goes back further than that. I'm not sure, but sort of the question here, I guess, is the nature versus nurture question that's been asked for quite some time.
Right. So I try not to believe in anything. So when you asked what do I believe, so what I do, the way I approach it
Yeah.
is to say to people to actually separate what they're seeing from what they're quote thinking or believing. So what do you see? So in that situation, you see, if it's true, you see Uncle Harry, who's this 50-year-old guy who has his own story. He acts goofy, right? He acts weird, and he's been in a mental hospital, and he's been on drugs, etc. And then you see this child who they say looks a little like Uncle Harry, right? Got some sort of resemblance. You see that he looks a little bit like him, and he also acts weird
Mhm.
a little bit, right? That's what you see. Is that right?
Yeah.
Now, do you see any gene causing this?
Absolutely not.
Right. Do you see any protein causing this?
Mm.
Do you see any autosomal dominant genetic inherited trait causing this?
Of course not.
No. All those things are not observable events.
Mhm.
All you see is one person in a family who looks a certain way and another who looks similar way, who acts broadly speaking a little bit similar. Now, nobody is arguing that like people don't look like their father or mother.
Mhm.
That's an observable event. And even though it's hard to admit sometimes, I would even say people actually like uh, behave in certain ways like their parents do.
Yeah.
I don't really like that with myself, but I know that it's true. So you see that. So those are now there's I don't see anything with genes or heredity. I mean, with not heredity. Sorry, that was the wrong word. I don't see any genes. I don't see any proteins. I don't see any of that stuff. So all that has to be obtained through science, right? Carefully done, controlled studies that tell you that the cause of this inheritance, right? The similar appearance is a gene.
Mhm.
That hasn't been done. In fact, just the opposite. Nobody has ever even shown that remotely to be true. So that part is a unproven hypothesis, and I would almost say it's been disproven. So you're
Yeah.
left with the fact that we do have something called inheritance, and we don't know why that happens.
Yeah.
Now, I would submit that the reason we don't know why that happens is the same reason why. So, I've done over the years a lot of interviews, and some of them come on the radio. And I remember years ago, I was driving in a car with a 3-year-old little boy, and an interview with me came on the radio. And he looked at me and he said, "Tom, how'd you get in that radio?" I said, "Well, I didn't because it's just like my voice." He said, "Look, it's in the radio." So so the problem is we have a science which has concluded that if something happens in an organism, it had to come from inside the organism, like a radio. In other words,
Mhm.
the sound in a radio must come from the radio. So you take a radio and you start dissecting it because you're looking for the sound. And you take the dials and it's got wires and it's got screws and I don't know what else in a radio, but a bunch of things. And you could even dissect it into atoms, except atoms don't exist. But let's just say there were atoms, the smallest thing you could get, right? The trouble is you would never find the sound because the sound's coming from the radio station and
Yeah.
radio waves, and all that. And that's pretty easily demonstrated. And that's what we're doing with living things. We say the blueprint for the living thing, including how you look and how you act and a whole lot of other things, must be in you. So we're going to take you and we're going to dissect it. So we get tissues, your liver. We look in your liver. We look in your heart. We don't find love, even though you
Mhm.
say you love somebody with all your heart. Okay, let's look. We go to the cells. No, even if there were cells, no love in your cells. Then you get to the molecules and the proteins. There's no love anywhere. But we are determined that it must be there. So we
Mhm.
keep looking, and we've spent at least 150 years looking for the origin of the radio, and we know that it's got to be in there somewhere, and it's not.
Yeah.
Doesn't matter how much money, how many people they got. I don't know how many trillions of dollars in research looking through radios to find where the sound comes from.
Too funny.
Great. And they
Yeah.
make you pay for it. Like, and if you don't agree to pay for it, they throw you in a cage.
Sure.
That's called government.
That sounds yeah, the best institution out there. It speaks to our materialistic mindset, right? And it speaks to, another fundamental problem in how science is conducted and just our, general mindset now that everything has to boil down to something physical. I was having a discussion with a friend and, he was talking about, the genetic drive of an animal. So like I have a herding dog, an Australian Shepherd, and he certainly has it in him that he knows and wants to herd. He herds his other dogs, trailers. If he sees birds, he wants to herd them. He herds us. It's definitely in him. And, my buddy was fully convinced that it was, this genetic cause. And I thought,
Ask him which gene it is that does it.
100%. But we had a great talk because it was like it doesn't need to be a gene. It's within him. We can observe this, but and that was my exact point was why does it have to be a gene? It's just in him and it's in his essence in a way. You could explain it the same way using different language. We have the observation and we have the story that's told about it, right? And we try to align our stories with our observations. And, I summed it up as essence in the moment, and maybe that's not the right way to go about it, but it was just to highlight the point that it doesn't need to be a physical gene. We can observe this that he wants to herd, but it doesn't have to be this genetic, physical, material drive. And I think that was sort of an important point.
But the point I'm making here is you have an observation which the dog likes to herd, right?
Yeah.
And that's true because you can see it. Now, then he's making a claim that the cause of this wanting to herd is a gene. You don't have to tell him who his real parents are, right? All
Exactly.
you have to say is, okay, prove that the gene causes this dog to herd. Now, he doesn't even know, first of all, how a gene is made into a protein and how a protein like that would cause a dog to herd. Like, explain how that happens. You mean if you get alpha gal 3 wow, I got alpha I'm herding these chickens. Like, is that what he thinks happens? If so, I would love to see the proof of that because
Yeah.
I don't think he's got it. In
Yeah,
which
definitely
case,
not.
yeah, he doesn't even know that most people who make claims like that, if you even asked them, well, how does a gene get translated into action? First of all, they don't know that. Where does that happen? They don't know that. It's supposedly on the ribosomes. How do you know a ribosome is real? Because every piece of every ribosome seen is a perfect circle, which means it's a sphere, which means they ground up the tissue in a blender, which means if you have an orange and you grind it up in a blender, what are the chances that every piece is a sphere? Right?
Pretty
It's
good.
nonsense. And doesn't matter. That's the story. I'm sticking with it. And
Yeah.
you don't have to come up with a story of why dogs herd. They like to herd. I don't know. It's
Yeah,
fun. That's
it's
like
fun.
I like to eat. They like to herd.
Great point. Great point. Yeah. Yeah. Really interesting. I think one of the reasons why like that we associate it to disease and whatever is because we take this observation and we try to just apply it to everything else. So we think, okay, so these seem heritable. We tell this story about it, but let's forget about the story. Like this, your son looks like your uncle or whatever. We know that there is some truth to heritability of a physical and maybe even a mental. And we take that and we apply it to the whole disease model. Well, if dad had heart disease, son's going to have heart disease, like that it's got to be inherited. At least the susceptibility needs to be inherited because, that family never had heart disease. None of them ever had heart disease throughout their whole, last 100 years when heart disease started, which is another point. But, like we can't necessarily just extrapolate these observations to everything else, right? We have to kind of remain within the observation, right? I feel like we're so far away from empiricism once again here.
All I can say is if you're going to claim that there's a deterministic factor here, that if your father has heart disease, therefore you're going to have to prove that, because that's
Yeah,
making a claim. And I don't think you can prove that.
yeah,
If you can, fair enough. But there's almost nothing in conventional science that actually they can prove using without using logical fallacies and delusional thinking and all kinds of tricks that are nonsense.
yeah, yeah.
But if they can, fair enough. I'm all for, if they can show something is real, then I'm happy to hear it.
Sure, sure. Now,
Like I said,
obviously,
one of
you're
the
a big.
factors here, and this was
Go
like
ahead.
with the virus thing, is I convinced myself very early on in my adult life not to have a dog in this fight. In other words, if there's viruses, and then I'll do what I need to do to deal with it. And if there's not, there's not. Like, I don't care.
Yeah,
I don't care if there's genes that make me belch, every 20 minutes or so. I don't do that actually, but um, if there is, there is, and then I
yeah,
probably can't do anything about it. But if it's because I eat too many blueberries, then I can do something about it. You know,
exactly.
and and I don't care which one it is.
Yeah.
And for some reason, that's like I think it was Upton Sinclair said, never try to convince somebody of something who makes their living believing the opposite. You try to
Mm,
tell a virologist that there's no such thing, and I mean, that's his whole worldview.
mhm,
And,
yeah.
I often joke, not that I ever joke, but, um, so imagine, so people say, well, why would they do that? I say, imagine, so here you are, a virologist, you work for a lab, or a university, and you hear this idiot Cowan, and he says you should do this test and see if there's a virus. So you do it. Turns out he's right, and it turns out there's no evidence for this particle. And you repeat it and you repeat it. You get the same thing over and over again, and then you go to your head of your department, and you say, "Look, I just here's what I did, and I checked it and did all the controls and rechecked, and I figured out there's no such thing." Guy looks at it and says, "You know what? You're right. And you know what else? You're fired." So he goes home to his wife, says, "Yeah, I'm really happy, proud of myself. I stood up and I gave this research to the head of the department, and he looked at it and he was really interested. And he said I was probably right." "Oh, good. And then what happened?" "He fired me." And so how are we going to pay for the Mercedes? I mean, so and we have these three children in private school. What are we going to do? Well, I thought I would grow carrots. What do you mean? You don't even know how to grow like a tomato plant. How are you going to grow carrot? You don't know anything except how to be a virologist because you went to school for 28 years out of your life, and all you learned how to do was to do virology experiments. You don't
Yeah,
even know how to like darn your own socks. You can't
yeah,
even cook oatmeal for God's sake. How are you going to grow carrots? You don't know anything. I'm divorcing your sorry ass. So, so the guy says, "You know what? I don't think I'm going to show this study to this guy. I'll just throw it away, do something else."
yeah. Well, we've confounded, true science, trying to understand nature and explain it with the profession of science. I know Vox sums it up very well. The practice of scientistry, right? The profession, academia, tenure, funding, all of these things add this on top of the theory ladenness that we all sort of possess. It just adds this whole aspect to trying to understand the world that we live in, makes it completely unreliable. And so you can't have a dog in the fight if you're going to try to to practice any sort of true science, to try to understand things or explain things or help other people heal or become the best version of themselves. You cannot be tied to certain theories, certain whatever, right? And that's what Kuhn talked about with the theory ladenness, and I think that's a really important thing, and we've separated philosophy and science. That's a whole other topic of discussion. But I like listening to my least favorite scientists like Neil deGrasse Tyson and all these guys. Right? They talk about we don't need philosophy and we don't need to learn about the scientific method. We just need to do science in the lab, and we don't need to think about it. We just need to observation, results, discussion, and write that big discussion and cite other people's discussions and not the results or the methods or anything like that. But it's just this whole cycle that's perpetuated into this crazy story that we tell ourselves. You have cell biology, circulatory system, our nervous system, especially the anatomy, the germ theory, virology. All of this is just crazy, and there's no logic to it. There's no common sense, and so that's why we appreciate you so much.
Well, the other thing that people don't appreciate it is, I mean, we live in a profoundly, as you're saying, profoundly scientifically illiterate culture. And the biggest offenders are the scientists and the doctors, and now some other
Yeah.
people. But and I mean, I'm trained as a medical doctor, right? And I worked as an ER doctor, so I know the rap, right? I'm not unfamiliar with the how it works, and nobody taught me or nobody told me when you come to a science paper to read the methods section. But that's the only section that's of any relevance. They can say what they can say. The title of the paper: "Isolation of Herpes Simplex 2 Virus," and they'll tell you in the discussion about how they isolated it and it was isolated here. That's irrelevant because all you have to do is go, what did they do? Well, they took some snot and they put it on a cell culture. The cells died. That's called isolation. And you think, fuck, like, and I never once read any of that stuff in medical school, right? And you think that these doctors are at least literate with science and how to read so-called scientific paper, and they're not.
No,
They have no
absolutely not.
clue. They don't even. They're like, you can't. Your car won't stop. You say you go take it into a mechanic. You say, I'm worried because won't go to a red light. Was car won't stop. I wonder if it's my brakes. And he says, what are brakes? And you think, I don't think I'm gonna go to a different mechanic because this guy's like an idiot. He doesn't even know the field. Like he doesn't know the basics of like the the the, the system you're working with.
Yeah, yeah,
And that's what it's
absolutely.
like. I mean, and I know people listening will say to themselves, all right, well, this guy makes a certain amount of sense, but there's no way he's right. Because like my neighbor, he's a scientist, and my uncle, he's a doctor, and they're like really smart people. They can't possibly be so unaware and delusional and bamboozled as he thinks. So Cowan, he must be missing something. Fine, go and ask him. How does a virologist prove there's a virus and show it caused disease?
Yeah,
It's the foundation of their life, practically their life's work. It's like a brake to a mechanic, and they don't know. Now they'll
yeah,
bamboozle you with some stuff, but if you know even a little bit about it, uh, but I would try it.
yeah. I think another good avenue too is ask them how they prove the immune system true, because there's not even any experiments they can do, right? That's purely based on their theories as well, right? Like it's it, there is no papers on the immune system. It's all just this underlying story that's told to kind of make everything fit, make everything work, right? So
They had this whole theory of antibodies, which have never been actually isolated from a person, and that they're shaped like a Y. But obviously, it's hard to get a picture of something that you can't find. Um,
yeah,
so they draw models. They'll show you like cartoons. But finally, they had something they thought was an antibody, and they did an X-ray crystallography, and it looked like a T. Now, the whole theory was that the antibody has these two arms and shaped like a Y, and one arm grabs the thing and the other arm grabs the other thing, and that's how it works. And then they finally get a picture, which actually isn't even a picture of the real thing, and it's not that. And do they
yeah,
say, well, turns out that's not how it works? They just say, no, never mind. It's like
unreal.
they show you that it's like the monkeypox virus. So they say we identified a monkeypox virus because it's rectangular on an electron microscope, and that was different than all the other viruses. So we know it's a distinct virus. And now they show you a picture of monkeypox virus, and it's just a regular old circle like all their other viruses.
Mhm.
And nobody says to them, "Wait a minute. You told me 20 years, 30 years ago that you knew this was a specific thing because it was shaped like a rectangle. And you show me this thing that's shaped like a circle and you say it's the same thing. How is that possible? Like I thought the whole thing was based on the fact that it's a rectangle. Yeah, but it mutated.
Another good one.
So now it became because it needed to evade your immune system, and we were catching on to the rectangle thing. So now now it had to change into a circle thing. I mean,
Yeah. You can't make this stuff up, but at the
it's a
same time, it's
comedy
all
show.
made up. So it's, yeah. Well, on that note, Dr. Cowan, I think might be a good time to kind of wrap things up. Is there anything that you want to kind of leave the listener with? Anything that you want to add to this discussion before we wrap things up? Or
Um, I mean, it's I'm good.
all right. Well, maybe you could tell the listener how they can find you, learn more from you, how they can support you as well.
Yeah, so we have a drtomcowan.com website. That's the main one. We also actually started, this is probably a big thing. We started an online clinic called the New Biology Clinic, where all the doctors and practitioners uh, approach people based on this kind of thinking.
Mhm.
And there is nothing like this otherwise. Basically, when you go to a doctor, they treat you based on theories, most of which are disproven. Like you have a virus, so you do this, or you have an autoimmune disease which doesn't exist. And so, therefore, you do this to damp down your antibodies. So, they're treating you based on theories. And because of that, you cannot get better truly because the theories are wrong. And so, how can you possibly, it's like, one of the ways I describe it is people say, well, what do you mean by it? I say, well, I know that the reason why like houses blow up like in the Ukraine is exploding unicorns, and so and they're invisible. That's why you can't see them. And I know it's true because I spread unicorn repellent around my house and it's not been blown up. That's the level of modern medical thinking that's going on here. And that's the proof that it was unicorns because every house I know, we spread unicorn repellent and not a single house has been blown up. So
Yeah.
that's what they're doing when they suppress your immune system. They're spreading unicorn repellent on you. So we don't like that approach. Uh, there's reasons why people get sick, and we try to deal with this. So that's the New Biology Clinic.
Mhm.
And then I wrote some books, and I have a new one called Common Sense Child Rearing, which I think is easy to read and hopefully help parents figure out how to deal with children.
Good. Good. Yeah. Amazing. Well, if you, the listener, get over to that Instagram page, Beyond Terrain, right now, uh, we're gonna give that book away in honor of having Dr.
Oh, good.
Cowan on the podcast today. So that's the least we can do. Yeah, that's great. Dr. Cowan, thank you so much for absolutely everything today. And that new biology clinic, I think, is the way. And it's, I was looking into it. It's extremely reasonable compared to what people typically sort of invest in this industrial,
Yeah.
medical, pharmaceutical industry we have going on. So thank you for that and everything that you do as well.
Okay. Thanks for having me on your show.
Certainly. All right, and I want to thank you all for listening. Just a quick reminder that this is not medical advice or any advice for that matter. This is for your informational purposes only. That being said, you are a sovereign being capable of thinking, criticizing, questioning, understanding absolutely anything. We in the greater forces are together self healers, self governable, self teachers, and so much more. And this is why the Beyond Terrain community exists. This is why I'm so passionate about it. We are done chasing trends, supplements, magic bullets, victim mindsets. We're leaving all of this in the past. If you're ready to take full responsibility, build true resilience, and gain wisdom to navigate the health and life that you want independently, this is the place for you. Right now, the wait list is open. Make sure to get in early to lock in that low price. Founding members have lots of perks and benefits. So make sure you go check that out over on the website. Links are all down below, of course. If you have any questions, criticisms, comments, or whatever about the episode today, please reach out on Instagram, beyond.terrain. You know where to find me. Listen, I really appreciate every single one of you for taking the time to listen. If you found the episode valuable in any way, please like, share, and support the podcast. Leave us a review or a rating, goes a long way on the podcasting apps as well. And just remember, there are two types of people in the world: those believe they can, those believe they can't, and they are both correct. So make sure to choose wisely. Thanks for listening, guys. Take care.